It's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists tonight who will give a 5-minute summary of the research before we open the floor for questions. Our first panelist, Morgan Paterasa, is a PhD student specializing in comics and film. Her research explores the ways in which comics incorporate other media forms and histories, ranging from read-along records to paper toys to GIFs, as well as material relationship between people and media objects. Her work can be found on Women Write About Comics, The Middle Spaces, and Comics Forum, and in the forthcoming issue of Horror Studies. Our second panelist, Jose Alanis, is professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures and the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Washington, Seattle. Has published two monographs, Comics, Comic Art in Russia, with University Press of Mississippi in 2010, and Death, Disability, and the Superhero, The Silver Age and Beyond, also with University Press of Mississippi in 2014. And two co-edited collections, Comics for the New Europe, Reflections and Intersections with Martha Coleman, with Leuven University Press 2020, sorry, and Uncanny Bodies, the Superhero Comics and Disability with Scott T. Smith in Penn State University Press 2019. From 2011 to 2017, he chaired the Executive Committee of the International Comic Arts Forum. His current book projects include Resurrection Comics in the Post-Soviet Russia and A History of Czech Graphic Narrative. Without further ado, I'll let our panelists take it from here to give us a quick introduction to their virtual presentations, which can also be found on the International Comic Arts Forum website.
Hey everyone, my name is Morgan Paterasa. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm so excited for this panel. My presentation is titled Comics as Archive, Documentation in UNA's Becoming Unbecoming. Becoming Unbecoming is a graphic memoir, and in it, the author presents her own experiences of sexual abuse and violence as both a child and an adult. Woven into her story are also the stories of other women who have been harmed or worse through acts of gendered violence. In particular, Una focuses largely on the 13 women who were murdered by Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper, between 1975 and 1980. I do want to take a brief moment to say that Una talks about violence against women, particularly cis women, but I think that her project can shed light on the sexual violence and trauma experienced by men, as well as gendered violence against trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks as well. At the core of Una's book are questions about the archive that constitutes information about the stories of women who have experienced gendered violence. A large portion of the book is made up of documents that are connected to or describe such attacks, including first-person narration, police statements, newspaper headlines, testimony, and other nonfiction documentation. Through these documents, Una reveals how the archive at the time of her writing really memorialized perpetrators and the acts of violence in themselves, while challenging or completely obscuring the testimony and experiences of victims. In other words, there are many gaps within the larger archive about gendered violence that are the result of carelessness, apathy, and violent institutional practices. Becoming Unbecoming works not only to fill these gaps, but also to facilitate new, notably non-misogynist ways of talking about the content of such archives. In my presentation, I am particularly interested in thinking about how graphic narratives can act as archives in themselves and also contribute to existing archives. I begin with Charles Meriwether's definition of the archive as, quote, distinct from a collection or library, and that which constitutes a repository or ordered system of documents, both verbal and visual, that is the foundation from which history is written, end quote. The stakes of creating and maintaining an archive that sufficiently accounts for and engages with the voices and stories of victims of gendered violence is clear in this definition, I think. If the archive is the foundation from which history is written, then the power of the archive relies on its existence. I also draw on Michel Foucault's conception of the archive as a practice in which the language that is facilitated by the archive and the history that is formed through the archive are malleable rather than fixed. Foucault argues that maintenance of and engagement with the archive can support what already exists, which is a misogynistic and violent portrayal of victims in the example of the Yorkshire River. However, Foucault also argues that changes in the archive as a practice can facilitate new relations and new ways of talking about those relations. In other words, changes in the practice allow for changes in the ways that history and understanding of people, events, and experiences are shaped by the archive. All of this is to say that Becoming Unbecoming not only challenges the archive of gendered violence as it exists, but also to expand and revise that archive in order to articulate a new kind of history about victims and their aggressors. Una moves towards this incredibly lofty goal by presenting positive representations of victims, amplifying victims' voices, and incorporating materials that capture the trauma of their experiences beyond two-dimensional facts, statistics, and reports. Becoming Unbecoming includes paper cutouts, portraits, standalone drawings, and visual representations of emotional and mental landscapes that work to capture the slipperiness of language in representing experience. Beyond my ICAF presentation here, these are the materials that have really captured my attention, particularly things like paper dolls, because they're so much different than the types of documentary materials that are usually associated with archives and historical narratives. Thank you.
Okay, Arturo, I guess I'll just go on.
Yes, please.
Okay, I guess I'll go on. So hello, thank you everybody for attending. My appreciation to ICAF and the executive committee and all who helped organize this event. And I'm always happy to present at ICAF in any format. So I'm going to share my screen here with you, I hope. I hope you all can see that. So yes, to provide a brief summary of my longer presentation on the ICAF website, this is Genocide, Armenian Comics and Mangasarians Prior to the Auction of Souls. This is part of a larger project dealing with Eurasian comics and the, broadly speaking, the recent history of graphic narrative in the former Soviet republics from Ukraine as far as Kazakhstan. So this is the part of the material that deals with Armenia. Armenia, by the way, was the last big trip I was able to take before the pandemic hit and before we went on lockdown. So I was very happy to be able to get back just under the wire and to do some of that research and meet some of these fantastic artists like Shamiran Khachatarian in Yerevan. So it is a project largely focused, like I said, on questions of representations of history and the cultural capital that has accrued to comics very, very recently after a period of relative dormancy in a lot of these cultures. Of course, every former Republican is a little bit different, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of what this material looks like. And if anybody has any questions or wants to discuss some of this, I can speak to it to some extent tonight. But my main focus tonight is Tigran Mangasarian, who is widely considered the father of modern Armenian comics. This is a picture of him from about a year ago in Yerevan. And you can see some of his background and some of his accomplishments there. Since about 2005, the mid 2000s, he has been working on graphic narrative in a long format, and particularly with works that are dealing with Armenian history. And he has produced a number of graphic novels and biographies devoted to the Armenian genocide, which obviously in 5 minutes I don't have time to cover. The Armenian genocide of 1915, 1917, a major pillar of modern Armenian identity formation. So in these works, he is advancing the rather radical notion in much Armenian culture, at least in the mainstream, of graphic narrative is capable of tackling large, complicated and painful historical traumas and other subjects like them. And it's a very, very thought out and very, very methodical market, a campaign that I think he has been engaged in for the last 15 odd years, very successfully within Armenia and outside, given that many of these materials are translated into English or other languages. The work that I focus on in the piece for today is called Prior to the Auction of Souls from 2014, which tells the true story of Arsha Lewis, or Aurora, as she is known in the West, Mardiganian, who fled the genocide in 1917 and winds up in America. All of her family is wiped out. She is able to produce, together obviously with people in the film industry supporting her, she's able to create a movie called Auction of Souls. It's also known as Ravished Armenia, where she can tell her account of the escape. And remarkably, and this is just an incredible story, she plays herself and she relives a number of the traumas and the horrible experiences there for the camera. So it is a remarkable, I think, achievement that is released in 1919. So in the graphic novel or biography, we see, of course, a whole parade of atrocities, and I've linked this, the representation of these events, to Marian Hirsch's concept of post-memory, among other things. What fascinates me about this graphic novel is the ways in which Mangasarian really kind of makes explicit and visually arresting the process by which history and narratives of historical trauma get produced. Arsha Lewis is telling her story before this very small audience that keeps growing over the course of the work, to engage them with various kinds of details, and yet the audience keeps interrupting her, keeps asking for follow-ups, or keeps redirecting her story. There's a kind of negotiation, if not brute imposition, upon her narrative that's being affected by, usually men, we should say. The audience itself, right, who is listening to her story is also depicted as reacting to it, often breaking down, crying, not able to hear anymore, in some cases putting their hands over their ears, as you can see there, because her narrative is so devastating. And then finally, and this is where I think the work of Hilary Shute and the representation of violence, and what she calls the radical visible, is so very useful, because of course it's in those moments when her own family is being slaughtered that the narrative becomes silent, right? It all is being conveyed through pictures. And what I wanted to do is just do something I don't do in the written piece, and just read very briefly from, not this page where her brothers and mother are being slaughtered by the Turks, but the page following this one, where she kind of recuperates her narrative voice. She says, "I stayed there for a few minutes, 2 or 3, while the Zaptiehs were holding me. But in those short minutes, everything I had in this world was swept away. My mother, my brothers, and my little sister, their bodies were at my feet. Both mother and Hovnan died looking toward me. Their eyes were looking into mine." So there you have almost a kind of lag, right? There's an inability to speak here, that the images are doing all of the storytelling. I relate that in the larger work to this concept of the radical visible that exceeds the mimetic, right? As Shute says, and I'm happy to get into more detail later on. I realize I'm pushing my time limit. And so the ways in which post-memory operates, the way trauma gets transmitted from a storyteller to the receivers of the story is explored here, when the director of the eventual movie is so shocked by hearing Arsha Lewis that he has to go home and check on his own son, even as that particular composition of that middle panel in the present day is mirrored in Arsha Lewis's memory by this same composition of her own father looking at one of her brothers who is going to kill in an act of resistance against the Turks. All right, well, thank you. I realize that I'm out of time. Thank you for indulging me.
Well, thank you, Morgan, Jose, thank you very much. While we wait for some questions from the audience, I have one for both of you. Both graphic novels in your presentations address the concept of trauma, and both in their own ways transit from an individual level to a social, national, or to even a historical level. How successful do you think these works are representing this multi-layered nature of trauma? And also, why do you think comics can be a more effective tool in the recovery of a collective memory?
Morgan, after you, please.
Okay. So I think that Becoming Unbecoming is successful in its like multi-layer connection between Una's story as a child and then as an adult, and connecting it to these larger narratives of gendered violence, and also specifically the stories of women who were murdered by Peter Sutcliffe. I think that one of the most successful aspects of her project is the way that she invokes a sense of community through kind of weaving together these different stories and kind of on different scales. Really, she's interested in kind of letting people know that they are not alone, and that, you know, she says the more numerous we are, the harder it will be for the world to ignore us. And so in this kind of sense of community building, but also the accumulation of both her own personal materials and these like all these other documentary materials, I think that really she does a great job of kind of showing how like larger questions are connected to like the individual experience. And as far as how comics themselves are effective as tools for memory, I think that comics aren't necessarily more effective than other media, but are certainly complementary of other media, especially because I'm interested in thinking of like an archive about a specific type of experience or trauma. We need, you know, lots of different types of representation in order to try to capture these type of experiences. But I do think that comics use their formal elements, right? So like gutters, the juxtaposition of images, different styles, things like that, to encourage readers to think beyond just text itself as a document. Trauma, I don't think, can only be represented or discussed using text only, because it's such a complex experience, and there are so many different complex ways to represent it. And Una specifically does this by incorporating, right, like these other types of documents. So just images, portraits, like I said in my summary, also like paper dolls. So thinking about like how these other material objects are part of kind of comics, but also part of these larger ways that trauma can be discussed and thought through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with basically everything that Morgan said about the formal capacities of comics for representing historical trauma. There's been great work, of course, over the last at least 10 years, maybe a bit more, from people like Hilary Shute and Nina Mikwitz and Ian Haig and Harriet Earle in the UK, writing on violence in particular, including historical violence. It really brings home to me how much responsibility people who are making graphic narratives about these sorts of historical traumas really bear, precisely because comics can be so powerful, and because the visual and verbal multimodality of the form can have such effectual power. In 2017, I presented on an earlier version of this work on Manga Serian in Germany, and there happened to be a person from Turkey in the audience. And after the and we got to know each other later, but he came up to me after the talk, and I knew he was Turkish before he came up, so I kind of was halfway expecting this, and he kind of told me that there's a lot of dispute about the genocide, and it's not even, it's kind of really manipulative and misleading to even call it a genocide. So you can imagine there's a whole discourse among people. So some people in Turkey regarding this event. And so he was incensed of that. He was very respectful. So, but it really brought home to me, right, that this is something that has real power to move people. In the case of prior to the auction of souls, in the longer work, I get into, yes, the formal techniques. My Turkish friend might call them tricks, but the ways in which Mangasaryan really kind of guides you to interpret these events in a particular way, and obviously to sympathize with the Armenian victims and to not sympathize with their oppressors, right? In ways that frankly are a bit dehumanizing of the Turks. And this is something, by the way, that also comes up in other accounts of various types of both historical and contemporary trauma, right? This is an ongoing issue in a lot of Joe Sacco's work. For example, like how he represents victimizers rather than victims. He often will obscure faces of Israeli soldiers in Palestine, for example. So there's a lot of discussion of that. But the main, I think, interesting and most remarkable and fruitful way in which Mangasaryan, I think, really guides the viewer's reading experience is by having the events in the present day when Arsha Lewis or Aurora is telling her story to these American film industry people. That's all in black and white. It's all in a wash kind of technique, so that the present day is kind of, saturated with a kind of gray tone that's kind of, monotonal, whereas all of the memories are vividly rendered in this, beautiful watercolor technique. And so it is automatically kind of recalibrating your eye every time you switch back and forth between past and present to understand that for Arsha Lewis, these are not just things that she recalls, right? This is not just her past. These are very much very living memories and very living events that are still driving her in the present day. And I think that kind of thing can really be brought forward in comics very, very boldly and very, very organically, perhaps better than in another medium.
Okay, thank you. It seems like we're starting to get some questions from the audience, so I would like to start going with those. They're asking, Morgan, they're asking you, does Becoming Unbecoming include commentary on the cultural aspects of gender violence from different parts of the world?
So Becoming Unbecoming is largely about experiences in the UK. It does talk about and bring in information about like the Bill Cosby trial in the United States. But largely it is focused on the UK and the US. I think that, as I said about kind of the conceptions of gender as represented in Becoming Unbecoming, there's a lot more to do. And I think that this particular graphic memoir is kind of working on one small piece of this much larger need to expand and revise the archive that we have about gendered violence, so that we can kind of better understand the different ways that like history is built through that archive. So I think that there are other comics out there that deal with similar issues, right? But this particular graphic narrative does not.
And there's one for both of you. What advice do you have for teaching these traumatic works to students to help prevent or to cope with secondary trauma?
Oh, wow. Morgan, would you like to take that one?
So if I were to use this comic to teach in a course, I would definitely start with some framing about, the difficulties of representing trauma, but also I always, when I teach something that I feel like could be really heavy, I always start by telling students about local resources available to them, specifically for talking to someone if they feel triggered or feel like they need support in another way. So I always frame it with like, these are people you can talk to, these are difficult subjects, and it's really necessary to take care of yourself. So that's kind of where I would start. But I probably also wouldn't use Becoming Unbecoming or something like it in like an introductory level course, because it is very intense, and the way that it works requires students who are already familiar with like comics as a form or as a medium as well. But teaching this kind of content is really, really difficult and can be traumatic for a lot of students. So it's hard to say. I would say just, give students resources to support themselves and take care of themselves first and foremost.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important. And fortunately, my university, University of Washington, has been pretty supportive in that, in giving us language that we can use in our syllabi, to giving people those resources. I'm always very leery, right? Because I'm not a trained therapist. I don't know. I don't want to be maybe, causing trouble when I'm maybe trying to help. So I can get that language from the university and direct students to those places, those resources where they can get them. I have not really taught this material at all, actually, in terms of a classroom setting. I have taught things like Mouse, things like Robert Crumb's work that dealt with sexual harassment. And I have dealt with, and I have taught From Hell by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell, which is a work, by the way, that I'd love to get your thoughts on, Morgan, given that it deals with such similar subject matter, only in a very, very different way. But so I think I would not obviously teach this early in the quarter. I think, like Morgan was saying, you want to at least establish some sense of a rapport with your students. Let them know, that you're there to talk about. I mean, if this stuff is too heavy, I have given students the option, particularly for sexual material that deals with sexual harassment, to opt out of the material and to maybe get an alternate reading of some sort or alternate viewing in the case of a film. So, because again, this is very powerful stuff. It's hot stuff. And I can say that the greatest question that an undergraduate ever posed to me in a class happened when we were reading From Hell. And they asked me as one of their questions in the middle of the class, why are we reading this? Why are you making us read this? And it was the greatest question I have ever received, because it led to a 1 hour long discussion that the students themselves were basically kind of carrying on between the merits of reading material that is traumatic, material that is even misogynistic, and having them come in some cases to not an agreement about it, but at least to an understanding that there was a lot of layers here that needed unpacking, and that whatever else one may think about From Hell, it's not a simple work in any way. And so, yeah, I think my short answer is, how do you teach this kind of stuff carefully and gingerly, and put it deep enough in the syllabus so that you've already built a level of trust and of like you were saying, Morten, of facility with graphic narrative.
Thank you. I see there are a lot of comments in the chat, people that are working with similar topics that I think can be interested then if you all want to get in contact. But while we wait for more questions, I would like to, I have a couple of questions for.
Just a note, Arturo, there's 3 questions in the Q&A portion. I know we're receiving questions from 2 different places. So the Q&A, if you open that up, there's 3 questions there.
Great, thank you. I was just checking the chat. Yeah. So the first that I have in this other section says, thank you for sharing your work and time with us today. Both presentations talked about comics' radical visibility or possibilities to challenge the historical archive. How do you both see these comics negotiate the demand for the visual as evidence or document, or the ways the visual is also wrapped up in the power dynamics of the archive or historical memory?
I guess I should go first since you went before, Morgan, or if you like. Please go ahead. This is from Meta. Hello, thank you. Wonderful question. Yeah, you know, I have, ever since I read Graphic Women by Hilary Shute, which is a wonderful, powerful work and extremely perceptive and useful in my own work. I've always felt a kind of leeriness about, again, the power of imagery and how comics, on the one hand, of course, require really great capacities from a reader, which only I think can make them more dangerous in the wrong hands, if that's the right way to put it. I also wonder, and maybe here I disagree a little bit with Morgan from something you said before, but I do think that trauma. I guess I worry that in graphic narrative or film or other visual media, that there's maybe a kind of reductive quality to images, particularly when we're dealing with painful subjects. Particularly, I guess, getting back to teaching, right? I mean, many of our students come into the classroom kind of with all sorts of assumptions about comics. So for example, when I teach mouse, right? Like, what do we know about funny animals? What do we associate with funny animals? What kind of funny animals do we know in comics coming in? And, you know, they'll say Calvin and Hobbes, or they say this and that, as kind of anthropomorphic animal characters. And, you know, and so that there is that risk, right? And of course, part of teaching mouse is kind of getting people to see how elaborate Spiegelman's use of the animal, the funny animal kind of trope is in that work. But it's I guess I worry that in some cases maybe images can lead us somewhat astray, I guess. And so that's, maybe I'm not articulating this very well. I guess I sometimes feel concerned that this can maybe lead to some works that are maybe that will be perceived by some people as maybe trivializing trauma or representing it in rather reductive ways. I'm not saying that Becoming Unbecoming does that, or any work that I can necessarily think of. When I taught Katie Green's Lighter Than My Shadow, a work that I'm, you know, a big fan of, and that I think works really well. I guess I'm as an older reader, I just, something about the cartooniness of that is I don't know. I think for some readers might lead them to certain kind of ways of reading that text. I'm not making any sense, so I'm going to quit. I'm going to stop there. Morgan, please dig me out of this hole.
Well, I think you know, part of what you're saying is that images can be really harmful, right? And that they
not intentionally,
right, but they still can harm nonetheless. And there is a part of what I think the question asks is about like the power dynamics, right, of looking and representing trauma in particular ways. Una in particular, let me actually see if I can share my screen to just show you some images from this book. So Una really handles images in kind of this interesting way in that they're often abstract. Most of the time they're connected her own experience instead of representing images of other people's trauma. And I think that's an interesting way for her to kind of navigate this boundary between the personal and kind of the larger communities that she's connecting with. Because ultimately we can only ever know our own story as well, right? And we only we can have or should have the authority to tell that story in ways that we perceive to be truthful and like respectful. But also I think that part of what I'm interested in Becoming Unbecoming is the way that images become and work as part of a larger archive. Not that they can stand for themselves as like a testament or an argument. They can, but as far as, you know, trying to create or expand an archive in order to create different understandings of a particular history, I think that images can work with and complement other types of documents to kind of capture experiences that text itself by itself can't necessarily represent, right? And so, for example, I don't know, the third image from the left where we see Una kind of dragging this sack or speech bubble, it kind of changes throughout her memoir, right? This image kind of conveys more of a sense of struggle and heaviness and kind of bleakness that maybe is difficult to translate into text. And so with the other documents around it, I think it kind of helps support this like archive building that she's interested in.
It's interesting how both works actually have these connections with the archive, no? Like one in a very explicit way, like Becoming Unbecoming, but also in the text you were analyzing, because the fact that you have this comic about the film that is telling the story of the genocide, no? We have some more questions here. One for Morgan. Una is fond of wordless images, especially of herself carrying empty balloons. So she's mentioning the image you were talking about. Another form of deconstructions. I'm thinking the broken up Una figure. What are these to your reading? Would you see this as acknowledgement of the silences inherent in trauma, and especially for women and sex workers, or as a visible archive gaps?
I think this is exactly the kind of question I'm interested in, that I'm working on. There's a lot to unpack and think about with these images. They're all different from one another in lots of ways. And I think any one of them is really fascinating and can teach us a lot. Like I said before, particularly, I'm interested in things like paper dolls and kind of the ways that something like a paper doll asks the viewer to like play with it in some way, or to manipulate it, to maybe cut it out, to use it in a way that we don't usually think about comics or narratives of trauma. But I think that there's a lot to talk about that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. So yes, thank you for that question. I'm sorry I don't have a very succinct answer for you.
Yeah, and there's another one that could be also kind of a follow-up to this one, is I would like to ask the panelists to expand on the use of silent pages, panels. Trauma, as many have argued, is resist representation or cannot be communicated. It can be said to be silent in some ways. In comics, however, silent panels and pages are often very loud, communicating a lot of information. How is silence used in these books you discuss?
Yeah, I spoke a little bit about it in my little spiel here. I was just going to say, actually, for Morgan, there might be also another layer to this use of the paper dolls, and that is, I don't know as much about the UK, but certainly in the US, you would have, particularly in comics that were oriented for girls, you would have like these little, like fashion, kind of little dresses and things you could cut out, and so there was an interactive quality to that was coded feminine. So it's, I don't know, maybe that would be kind of something there, and the way, given that Becoming Unbecoming is so much about obviously a woman-centric kind of way of looking at that tragedy and at those events. But it's yeah. So silence, like I said, I think it's a brilliant kind of portion of that. Well, I don't need to show it again because it's obviously very a hard thing to see, but it's I like the way that the question puts it, that silent panels and pages are often very loud, communicating a lot of information. In the page that I showed from Prior to the Auction of Souls, it's very loud, partly because it's a kind of a hellish representation. It almost looked like the panels are on fire. It's got a real kind of red and orange and yellow kind of texture to it that is nightmarish and horrible. I think there are ways, like I said, in which in moments like that, and in other examples that I have treated in my other work, for example, in some of what I've written about comics representations about the Holocaust, it's this sense of too much, right? It's this sense of excess. And another maybe great advantage that graphic narrative has over other media in representing trauma is that it can represent it, right? It would be a lot harder to watch a movie of little kids being killed, or even to have, you know, that kind of footage. But of course, comics can put you right in the middle of that event, and as horrible as it is. And so it's the silence, I think, is not really a silence. I very much like the way that you put it. It's a loudness.
Yeah, we have another question. One thing I see often in comics depictions of trauma is acknowledgement of the failure of representation. So we continue with the same motif. For example, the silence was showed in Manga Sarayan's work, or the all-black panel in Satrapi's Persepolis, the blank panels or empty areas that come at a terrible moment of loss in Borsellino's King Cat 75. Is this a form of self-critique of comics, admitting the concern about images that Jose expressed? Jude says comics challenge the unrepresentability of trauma that they dare to show, but is discretion or withholding a key part of comics approaching trauma?
Yeah, Charles, brilliant question. Nice to see you here. Yeah, I think that's exactly kind of what I'm talking about in the case of Persepolis and that black square. And the way that that Satrapi withholds, right? And you could also argue, following up on Nancy Pedri's point, that black square is maybe the loudest panel in Persepolis, precisely because it kind of forces the reader to imagine and to in a sense kind of you know, provide that dead little girl killed by the bombs. So questions of, I guess that's kind of what I was trying to articulate a little bit before about the immense power that imagery sort of has. And I worry sometimes that maybe to not show would actually not only be maybe more respectful on some level, perhaps, to the events or to the people involved, especially if they're real stories, but also that it would avoid, or it would elide the risk of reductivism. Yeah.
I think too, like, you know, part of one of the many strengths of comics is that you have this mediation, right, where the artist or creator can decide how much to show or not show. And so as opposed to something like a photograph, right, or a film, they can really decide how much distance they think is respectful or appropriate. And I think that's a really powerful way that comics can handle image. Not necessarily that they are really good at it or really bad at it. I think it's really in the hands of the creator. But I think that this idea of like withholding versus showing, representing versus, as you wrote in your question, as a daring to show, right? A comics artist or creator can make all of those decisions about exactly how they want those images to appear. And for Una, she redraws all of the photographs that she is referencing. And there's something about that kind of distance that is interesting, that I think that is also connected to kind of the previous question about silence, right?
Yeah, if I could just follow up a little bit as well. There's, I think the other risk with showing is that then it puts the representation, there's a risk of kind of falling into a kind of generic framework. And this is what I mean is, you know, discussions of Schindler's List, for example, in film, whereby one of the big critiques of that film is that Spielberg makes it too visually engaging. He makes it kind of too much of a Spielberg film, right? And that there are certain moments, and there are even quotations of Psycho, for example, when they're looking through the keyhole or through the hole there into the showers. That there is this risk of you know, that these real stories of real historical trauma or of violence against women or violence against a whole people and genocide, that will kind of fall into, you know, sort of a horror type of framework or a certain kind of cliche, and that not showing can maybe try to sort of avoid that. Although, of course, that's also can be a cliche to not show, right? Whether you're Michael Moore not showing the collapse of the Twin Towers in Fahrenheit 9/11, or many other numerous examples, or Quentin Tarantino not showing you an ear being lopped off in Reservoir Dogs, kind of literally turning the camera away. So I think all of these questions are or all of these examples or these artists are I think on some level kind of grappling with this question, that there's a, how do I put it, a kind of there's too much of a givenness sometimes to imagery that they might try to avoid, and I think maybe that's what we're seeing now in the case of From Hell. It's completely the opposite. It's all about let's show as much and everything and as horrible and terrible as we can, and that has its own obviously downside.
I think too that like what you're talking about is part of why I'm interested in the archive and comics as being archives and contributing to archives, because as I was kind of saying with trauma, like no one way is going to be able to capture everything, especially when you're talking about like a national trauma, like you're talking about with the Armenian genocide, or just patterns of gendered violence, right? The archive needs to be much bigger in order for us to accurately understand and engage with the narratives that are in it and kind of to build a larger story, because they're showing or not showing at times could be good, it could be helpful, it could be harmful, it could be disrespectful, it can be all of these different things. But the more things that we have to kind of reference, the better off we're going to be. And so, you know, instead of always silencing a particular voice or always silencing a particular image, you know, finding different ways to kind of build this whole network of relations is really kind of a strong way to engage with trauma in lots of different capacities.
Mm-hmm.
We receive another question. They say, what about trauma in literature? I'm thinking of Gareth Haynes' treatment of The Pit and the Pendulum, or even the EC comics of the 1950s that allow artists go forward while artists dealing with real trauma might hold back, although Dean Haspel went fairly fair in Cuba My Revolution.
Would you like to take this one for me first? Or I can do it. I can try.
So I think if I'm understanding this question correctly, you're asking about like fictional representations of trauma versus nonfiction.
Yes, I'm assuming that that's what they're trying to ask here. No, like maybe there's no attempt of trying to control yourself when you represent violence in any other kind of fictional work. No, but it seems like there's always this dilemma when we deal with historical or real trauma.
I mean, I think that. Sorry.
Oh, please go ahead. Sorry.
I think that something like, I don't know. I think that we should always be aware of how violence against bodies is being represented, and we should always ask, like, to what purpose what is the purpose of this image, or what is the purpose of depicting it in this particular way, whether that be a particular style or that be in a particular angle or showing a particular amount of harm or injury.
Yeah, like there's a sensationalistic kind of maybe aspect to some material sometimes that one doesn't want to fall into. Sarah, hello, thank you for the wonderful question. I like your reference to EC Comics, because I think that's a nice bit of pushback, I guess, a little bit to my concerns over the generic pitfalls that maybe we might fall into, because of course, and I'm thinking of works like The Guilty, right, by Feldstein and Wood, which is about a lynching of a Black man, but it's told in a kind of very standard, for the most part, kind of EC style, with the very blood curdling kind of font for the title, and you've got kind of sensationalistic sort of captions, but of course it's a dead serious story, and it does treat it with I think the right level of complexity and nuance. So yeah, I think if you've got people who know what they're doing, I think yes, you can put something into a kind of crime suspense stories kind of style, or a horror kind of style that can actually work better, that can almost kind of queer the trauma, if you know what I mean, that it can represent it with kind of irreverence rather than melancholy, or rather than with horror or with other ways. Obviously, this gets you're stepping into a minefield, right? If depending on the subject matter, I think we're very far away. It would be hard for me to imagine someone in Armenia today writing a graphic novel that a comedic treatment of the genocide in a graphic novel form. That would be extremely offensive. So it's a but I think EC Comics, at least in works like that, is a kind of sort of approaching that idea. So it's a complex approach, and again, it can backfire.
Yeah, I think it's particularly complex too, when even if the story itself is fiction, that it's representing a violence that happened in real life to real humans, right?
Yes, and I see that Meta is comparing our conversation to Francesca Lynn's Lent to War talk at ICAF 2019 about the refusal of closure, moments of friction, or refusal.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. I think we're reaching the end of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this truly rich conversation, and a special thanks to our panelists for sharing their ideas and research with all of us tonight. Please check out the rest of our virtual panel series on the ICAF website at internationalcomicsartforum.org. Our next roundtable will take place on Thursday, March the 4th, and will be entitled Graphic Activism, the Extraordinary, the Ordinary, and the Precarious. We hope to see you there. Thank you again.